So once again, Russ, I'm reminded with this summer's Olympics that I'm just not going to be able in this life to realize my Olympic dream.
And what's your dream, Mike?
I've always thought that in the race competitions, there's always one guy. They all train really, really hard, and they're just these great athletes. But there's always one guy that finishes last, you know?
True.
Somebody has to finish last. So I feel like you did all that training, and then you finished last. Well, you didn't really have to do all that training, did you? You still would have finished last. So here's where I come in, okay? I am a professional last place finisher. So they put me in the race, right? And everybody races, and I'm last place. So the second to last place guy didn't finish last. His training paid off. He beat the ordinary guy.
Interesting.
What do you think?
So like a designated last placer.
That would be me. I want to set up that whole company where I just, have all these employees that just finish last in races.
You'd probably be equally qualified for all the events then.
Yeah. I don't think I could do like pole vaulting or jumping and stuff like that. I don't know. But that's what I want to do. So, everybody, it's win-win because the last place guy finishes second to last and I get to stay fit.
Yeah.
Be
enough exercise for you probably.
Right. I had to train lightly, whatever. Anybody out there who wants that idea, I'm too old for it now. Somebody else could take that over, propose it to the Olympic Committee, and get them to pay you for it because it's a lot of work to finish last.
There we go with our first foray into sports commentary.
Oh, we haven't done that yet, have we? Have I never mentioned sports? I can't believe it.
And in case you think you've got the wrong podcast, you're listening to Adult Music.
Yeah.
The podcast with music for the mature mind. This is episode 176. Wow. I'm your co-host, Russ.
And I'm your co-host, Mike. And I just want to mention, I may be talking about sports, but if you look behind that, I'm really doing what I always do and talking about me.
We have to personalize things a little bit here as we make it through all of this new music we talk about every week.
Right.
Bringing you 6 recordings in each episode, mostly classical and jazz, what we think are the most interesting new releases. Before we get into this week's program, I want to give a special thanks to pianist Luis Capdevila for sharing our episode last week. If you haven't heard it, be sure to go back and check out his recording, Monpou Revisited, Intimate Impressions. He hails from the same region as Monpou, who has interesting classical miniature compositions. We've always been fascinated by them, and Mr. Capdevila gave us his jazz versions. Go back and check out last week's episode and find the links to his recording. Anyway, thanks for sharing the episode.
Yeah, I think we have a thing for miniature pieces anyway. There's something really magical about them. They say a lot in a very short time.
I like that.
Is one of those. We like Satie too. We just like all these composers who do short works.
Yeah, something concise. And they're their own little worlds too. They're really nice. Well, we don't have any other good news or bad news this week in the music world. That's good. So let's just jump into this week's program. In the episode description, you'll find links to Spotify, Apple Music, and Amazon Music for all of the music we're going to discuss. Also, at the top of the description, there's a link to the full episode playlist, all the music in one place, on Deezer, CD quality streaming music from France. You can get the podcast there, too, if you want to listen to everything in one place. Now, if you can't see the full description or the recording list or links are hard to follow on whatever app or platform you listen to us on, you can always come over and check us out on our host site. That's Podbean, PodBean.com. Everything is clear and easy to follow there. If you enjoy the podcast, please follow or subscribe wherever you listen to us, and be sure to tell a music-loving friend. Help us grow our audience. And if you take a moment to give us a ranking or write a short review, it helps us get listed in the music category recommendations, another way we can increase our audience. Please also come over and follow us on our Facebook page to get extra info and more new releases throughout the week. You can leave a message or comment there as well. And if you want to contact us directly with any comments or questions, we'd love to hear from you. Our email address is adultmusicpodcast, all one word, @gmail.com. We play music samples of the recordings we discuss, and here is our fair use disclaimer. Music sample clips are for commentary and educational purposes. We recommend that listeners listen to the complete recordings, all of which are available on the streaming services in the links provided. And we also suggest that if you enjoy the music, you consider purchasing the CDs or high-quality downloads to support the artists. And all that said, we're ready to jump in. We've got a modal thing going on this week, Mike.
Yeah, modes, we got 'em, as we say in those mom and pop stores. And we have all modes this week. We're all moded up, so let's go.
Loads of modes.
Loads of modes. There you go. The most obvious place to find modes in classical music is in the Renaissance era, when they were really the mainstream of church music. And so our first album has to do with that. This is called Queen of Hearts. It's by an ensemble that we've grown to like a lot on this podcast. I think we may have talked about all of the records they've done since we started the podcast.
Could be, yeah.
The Gesualdo 6, directed by Owain Park, who also sings in the ensemble too. This is on the Hyperion label. It came out on June 28th. All right. The Renaissance was a time when modes were king. Yes. And kings and queens were in mode. Think about that. This album explores Renaissance-era music that venerates the Virgin Mary, of course, and I'm glad we're giving her so much attention on this podcast. You know, last year we did Monteverdi's Vespers for the Blessed Virgin, one of my best albums of 2023, so go check that out too. That was by, I can't remember, Raphael Pichon, but I forget the ensemble now. Anyway, it's on Harmonia Mundi. It's a really great record. So not only does this album venerate the Virgin Mary, but it memorializes the queens of Europe, Mary's terrestrial counterparts. So Mary ruled heaven, and these queens ruled their part of the earth. Anne of Brittany, Margaret of Austria, and in England, Anne Boleyn and Mary Tudor. So Anne of Brittany has a pretty interesting story. Her heart was broken repeatedly over her lifetime, and many songs were written for her as a result. Her heart was removed and stored in a stunning gold reliquary after she died. These kind of things drive me crazy. When you go to Europe, especially in Italy, like if you go into churches, they'll often have like body parts of the saints, you know, just in glass cases or just, you know, in somewhere where you could see them. It's
kind of creepy.
Kind of creepy.
Yeah.
They really took those holy, you know, power things literally back in the day. Anyway, so Anne of Brittany's heart is in a gold reliquary. The reliquary miraculously survived the French Revolution and is preserved today in her home city of Nantes in France. Many chansons mention the heart, especially in the tragic sense applied in Regrets chansons, of which we'll hear quite a few here. These are songs that sing about regret. They're about regret, especially the heart's desires and downfall. Thus, the program here came to be titled Queen of Hearts, because it's about queens, and Anne of Brittany's heart has become sort of famous. So let's get into it. There are a lot of tracks on this album. Track 1 is by Antoine Brumel, Sub Tuum Praesidium. So we're going to have Latin and French for the most part on this album. This one's Latin. It's a simple prayer to Mary for protection. The gorgeous blend of voices this ensemble produces is heard quietly in the bass end at the beginning, and this starts out really nicely. Let's hear it. This ensemble has such focused sound. It's really amazing. I just never really get tired of it. I also want to mention, hearing that opening made me think of why I prefer like digital to LP records, because you would hear all the surface noise on the LP record, and just to hear that sound just come out of nothing is really magical. So there it is. I like digital sound for that anyway. Anyway, the music quickly climbs into higher ranges as the verses flow by. Vowels are stretched out, but there's little melisma. Remarkably, all of the words are clear on this fantastically clear recording. This very brief prayer is stretched out to 4.5 minutes in this gentle setting. Tracks 2 to 3, Josquin de Pré, Praetor Rerum Serium. This is a quasi-symphonic work and the impressive architecture of the work belies moments of tenderness and grandiosity in alternation. Track 2 is the first part of this prayer, Praeter Rerum Sirium, which means beyond the order of this world. This starts with lines growing like vines, moving outward further and further with each repetition. Listen to this. This is very cool. You kind of feel like we're getting further and further from the origin with those climbing sort of motifs. The text is about the Virgin bearing Jesus. There are lovely repeating figures that catch the ear in the higher and middle voices once we reach the 1 minute and 20-second mark. Lovely harmonies in this work with some open fifths growling out of the texture at times. It's a sound I really love. Track 3 is the second part of the prayer, and it is a new section too, Virtus Sancti Spiritus. This verse starts differently, mostly in the falsetto high end. I love the way certain voices will suddenly drop out of the texture, lightening it unexpectedly and giving a feeling of intimacy to the sound. The verses pick up a triplet rhythm by the second minute of this track, and therefore a light, flowing, dance-like quality. We don't really associate rhythm with music from this period, but it does appear at times in these performances. Track 4, Doisette compère. Plein d'ennui and anima mea. So we have a French text and a Latin text sung at the same time. This is a setting that conflates court affairs in spoken language with sacred or biblical texts in Latin. The upper parts duet in French verse above the bass part's Latin text in the manner similar to using chant as a cantus firmus, a technique called cantus prius factus. So all that means is that you have two texts at the same time. One is in the vernacular language and one is in Latin. In the text, the French secular text has the poet longing for death so his boring life will end. While the sacred... How contemporary is that idea? While the sacred Latin text from the Song of Songs complains that the poet languishes from love. The composition layers the two verses simultaneously, yet the ensemble's clarity helps the listener hear both. This is a little bit of a miracle, really. Let's sample the beginning. The recording even gets the effect of the higher voices sort of soaring into the vault of the church. You know, the sense of space. It's really wonderful to hear. Track 5, Josquin des Prés. Again, this is Mia Regrets. The Mia Regrets text is heard often on this album. It's another text longing for love, and here it's in medieval French. It's mostly in block harmony, flowing by with great clarity to the words. A gentle setting of the words is used. The ending is especially tender as the singer says he will soon end his days. There's a lot of these sort of, it's going to end for me soon sort of songs from this era. Track 6, Antoine Brumel, Sicut Lilium inter spinas. The text is simply, as a lily among thorns, so is my beloved among women. It's from the Song of Songs, which is sung in Latin. I found the opening to be captivating, so I'm going to sample that. We had a full pause there at the end. The setting soon settles into simultaneous harmony in each syllable, with some melisma momentarily developing. Track 7, Pierre de la Rue, Secrets Regrets. La Rue was a favorite of Martha of Austria, a major patron associated with the Regrets chanson repertoire. The first Regrets chansons were written for her. This song uses duets and simple syllabic statements which then overflow to pour out the grief of the text into long, sobbing melismas. This starts in the bass end, with the other voices piling on after the title is stated. The shifting of focus between various voices is ear-catching. Tracks 8 through 10, Costanzo Festa, qui dabit oculis. The text laments the death of Anne of Brittany in 1514, and it's in 3 parts. All 3 tracks are really the same prayer. Track 8, Qui debis oculis, the opening of the lament, begins in polyphonic fashion, with each voice entering about a measure after the previous. I think it sounds symmetrical. It may not be, but it sounds that way to me. The voices move closer to simultaneous syllabic singing, but there's always a sense of independent voices. The text asks why France weeps, and we find out in track 9, which is Heu nobis domine. It's a new verse, a subtle change of approach, and here voices enter in harmony with higher voices coming in polyphonically. Anne of Brittany's name is mentioned in this verse, so France is weeping because Anne of Brittany is dead. Let's hear the opening of this track and the beginning of this section. I also love it when composers separate the entry of each voice so that you can hear the words clearly pronounced, as you did on the entries just before I faded out. Track 10, Ergo ululate pueri, has a subtle change. The voices layer together more quickly this time, in a highly appealing way. Here there's a separation between the higher and lower lines. The text urges Anne to rest in peace and for the people to mourn. I really love the setting for the words requiescat in pace, or rest in peace, at the end, so I'm going to sample the end of this track. It has a kind of orchestral tuning sort of quality to it. Track 11 is by Owain Park, the director of the Gesualdo 6, so this is a contemporary work. It's called Prière pour Marie, and is written for this recording. It sets a prayer uttered by French peasants during Mary Tudor's journey to her wedding with Louis XII to become his third wife, following the death of Anne of Brittany. It reflects upon the blurring of the boundary between queens terrestrial and celestial. Marie au ciel, that's the Virgin Mary, and Marie en la terre, which is Mary Tudor. You can tell this is a contemporary setting due to the harsher elements of the harmony, which always sounds spacey and alien to me when sung by a choir of this caliber. Here's a sample just to give you a subtle jolt. You can hear all those suspensions and things like that. Yeah, making this very contemporary. If you found yourself drifting away to the gorgeous flowing modal lines on the album up to now, this might bring you back in a bracing way, but the setting remains gentle. Remember when we were younger, people used to use aftershave? You know, you'd just slap it on your face and it would really sting. Like that Aqua Velva. Yeah. I almost feel like this piece sort of has that effect when you hear it as track 11 on this album after the first 10 tracks. Track 12, Antoine Brumel, Du Toit Plongé and Four Seulement. So we have two French texts here. Orchid Game wrote a setting of Four Seulement for 3 voices, and this composition takes his superius part as an altus line and complements it with a different text in other parts, which is Du Tout Plongé. The low-lying bass part plunges into the metaphorical lake of despair. The text is hopeful at the end, and the lowest voice parts emerge from the depths to indicate that. Both texts are in French and move slowly in this setting. Track 13, Antonius Dimitris, Ista est speciosa. This comes across with a lighter, more transparent sound than the previous Brumel, and it also has a light bounce to the rhythm, so I thought I'd sample this for a bit of contrast to what we've been hearing. Yeah, a tricky little avoidance of the cadence at the end. Track 14, Johannes Prioris, Dulcis Amica Dei, a brief setting of a plea to the Virgin Mary. It's rather austere in its voicings, plain and direct. Track 15, Jean Mouton, Tota Pulcra S, another fairly brief setting at 2 minutes with fuller harmony and an opening line that sounds like an ending to a piece. The text is from the Song of Songs, and the ending is harmonically inconclusive. Tracks 16 and 17 are the prayer Salve Regina set by Jean L'Héritier. Track 16 is the beginning, Salve Regina, or Hail Queen of Heaven. It's a prayer to Mary. It's got a generous harmony at the beginning of this setting. The setting is polyphonic and the voices flow in a slow, thickly syrupy way. Let's sample it. And again, we have those wonderful, subtle passing harmonies in there as well. I really enjoyed zeroing in on especially the bass and how it supported the structure above it in this. There's a nice coming together in harmony to end the track. And then on track 17, the prayer continues, Ea ergo. The first syllables start off simultaneously sung and then begin drifting into polyphonic lines. The textures thin out at times, revealing the sensitivity of the vocal lines. Track 18, Ninfea Crutwell Reed's setting of Plaisir n'est plus. Now, Crutwell Reed is a contemporary composer as well, so this is the other contemporary composition on this album, and it will have more contemporary harmony to it. This was specially commissioned for this recording, and it sends Clément Marot's poetry of around 1532. The work is influenced by monodic psalm singing, but is then expanded and transcends the harmony of the early Renaissance to explore the seconda pratica, recomposing cadential figures favored by Monteverdi and Gesualdo. Yeah, we can actually hear it start sounding more Baroque as it goes. Before pushing this yet further in chromatic twists and turns. It's actually a very clever piece if you know your music history, your musical sound history, let's say. The opening has some subtle modern harmony in it, giving a blurring feeling. Let's hear that. Ouch. It's quite a harmony right there. And it goes on to greener pastures, and even we hear some Baroque endings at times too. The verses are sung simultaneously in harmony at the beginning, and there are some harmonic surprises in store, such as the one you just heard. By the first minute, we're hearing obvious dissonances. The rhythmic pattern of the verses changes in an inventive way to encompass the accents of individual words. The harmony towards the end is sumptuous and feels like something is being surpassed. There's a primitive quality to the rhythm and the bass in the last lines. Crutwell Reed has encompassed a lot of musical ideas in this composition from different time periods, including the present. It's a really interesting work. Track 19, Jean Mouton, De Tous Regrets. A brief setting, starting mournfully, then rather surprisingly speeding up in mid-verse to encompass the words. There are all sorts of appealing effects, like the certain phrases being handed off between voices. There are quite a few ideas in this brief piece. Track 20, Antoine de Fervin. This is the first time we're hearing him on this album. This is his setting of Vos Seulement. This uses the cantus prius factus technique, and here Fervin opens with an ornamented echo of Matthias Pipelade's setting of A Woman's Lament. Syllabic structure overflows into beautiful descending melismas. The lower voices get the first statement of the line. This is the first time in the album that we're hearing a setting of Vos Seulement by itself. It's fairly brief and moves slowly with a lamenting tone. I like the spaciousness of the setting, and the lower voices are often isolated and can be heard clearly. I'd like to sample just the last 40 seconds or so of this work. And that is how it ends. Track 21, Johannes Prioris, again, Consumo la vita mia. This is in Italian, and is probably written for the death of Anne of Brittany. This setting is under a minute and a half, and sets only 2 lines. I eat up my life little by little, and I dare not ask for any reward. Sung in Italian. These people really did face reality head on, didn't they? I like the nasal tone the upper voices get at about the 1 minute mark. Track 22, Nicolas Gombert, Tous les Regrets. This is our final Regrets work of the album. It starts with a rising figure and continues with transparency in the harmony. The way the verses are accented gives the piece a pulsing quality as it goes into the second minute, and I want to sample that so you can hear what that sounds like. And I hope you're trying to pick out that bass voice because it sounds really great. The voices are all admirably caught on the recording in crystal clarity, as I mentioned at the beginning. Track 23, the final track, Jacobus Clemens non Papa. Now, Clemens non Papa is not his actual name. It means his name is Clemens, but there was a Pope Clement at the time, so this means Clement, not the Pope, the other guy. The composer Clemens. Anyway, this is his Ego Flos Campi a Set, or 7 voices. This is the last track that Gesualdo 6 recorded with their outgoing bass, Samuel Mitchell, who had been with them for 7 years. The piece evokes the living waters flowing forth from Lebanon. Its dense but masterful permutations and combinations of upper and lower voices give the work plenty of air and space in an almost polychoral manner. This is the big album ending track. It has 7 voices. It's very transparently written, though, and doesn't feel heavy at all. I'm going to play this from the 1 minute mark, and we'll get a brief sample of it. And that's the album. So as we've come to expect from a Gesualdo 6 recording, the voices are crystal clear and blend together beautifully, and the engineering is exemplary, with the voices blending together yet isolated enough in the texture to be clearly heard. So I'd like to give a shout out to recording engineers David Hinnett and James Waterhouse, and recording producer Adrian Peacock. The entire album shimmers in sound, and part of this is the programming. Owain Park and Gesualdo 6 have once again found an enticing theme and have found a group of works that show off the ensemble's versatility, as well as the variety of approaches heard in works of the Renaissance era. Every album this ensemble does is a revelation in some way, due to the themes and programming, not to mention the performances. This is not to be missed, and you should go back and hear all of the Gesualdo 6's other recordings too.
As always, Gesualdo 6 provides us with a great recording here, mesmerizing vocal tone and phrasing. The different approaches to harmonic movement really held my attention throughout the recording. He starts out with these sort of more block chord movements, and then you have the spreading lines in the other pieces. And Renaissance harmony always has some surprises to our ears that are more used to post-Baroque conventions. So I always find something interesting in these recordings. I also enjoyed the really close harmonies of Park's original composition and the other contemporary composer work there as well. Those really made me sit up and listen with the close intervals and suspensions. And I'm always really happy to hear something new from this vocal ensemble.
All right, our second classical recording is called Badinerie, and it's a French word, and it means something you do instinctively without taking it too seriously. So this is going to be a pretty light album of music. It's a flute and harp recording, and the musicians are Julien Beaudiment on flute and Marie-Pierre Langlamet on harp. It's on Orchid Classics, and it was released on July 19th. So judging by the booklet notes, Beaudiment and Langlamet both have as much of a sense of humor as the title of this album suggests. The booklet author, Beaudiment, writes that compared to the difficulties of playing a harp with all of its pedals, playing the flute is as easy as organizing a strike in France. Can you imagine if there was a strike now during the Olympics? Man, that would really cause havoc. The two have been playing together for 15 years, but had never gotten around to making an album together, and finally here it is. Beaudiment also remarks that the album could be seen or thought of as a travel postcard, and it's one that we should be happy to have, because this is a really fantastic album.
Yeah.
So Beaudiment says the album is full of discoveries, surprises, challenges, depth, but most of all a tribute to this duet, which makes music alive and gives the duo happiness, which they hope you, the listener, will feel as well. And Langlamet is responsible for all of the harp arrangements that aren't otherwise listed as being by someone else. For example, the harp arrangement in the first track, Francis Poulenc, Sonata for Flute and Piano, FP 164, a very famous work, and here we're hearing it for flute and harp. The first movement of this three-movement work is marked Allegretto Malinconico. The tempo is pretty quick, and the piece is pretty with the harp accompanying. It does change its character a bit. Let's hear it. Wanted to get that little harp riff in there before I fade it out. So the harp actually makes the movement sound more pastoral in feel. Both musicians are alive to the sudden rhythmic changes and draw them out beautifully. Some very impressive flute playing by Beaudiment in the faster passage is heard, particularly at this rather fast tempo, and of course Langlamet must be lauded for her arrangement and performance of the gorgeous harp part. The harp introduces the middle section and has some solo sections as well. Sound is clear and palpable. Track 2 is the second movement Cantilena, marked assez lente. The harp begins this very quietly, drawing the listener forward in his chair. The flute comes in at a rather quiet tempo, playing the melody. The harp achieves an appealing palpability via Langlamet's full, focused sound. Let's see if I can give you sections of that. I'm going to start this from around 2 minutes in. The harp softens the impact of the piano part at points, especially during dramatic climaxes, but this doesn't hurt the piece at all. The gesture comes across, yet we're always submerged in the beauty of the harp's timbre. The movement mostly comes across as melodic and soothing. Track 3, the third and final movement, Presto Giocoso. Again, I like what the harp brings to this movement's rhythm. It sort of has the flute floating over more of an empty space because of the harp's thinner, less opaque timbre, let's say. Let's sample this from the beginning. The attack is softer and less aggressive than it would be with the piano, but as in the second movement's climax, the sense of that aggression is there. I really enjoyed hearing this piece in this arrangement, especially due to its rich, warm sound towards the end. Track 4, Mozart Adagio from Flute Quartet in D major, KV 285. So here we start a set of shorter works, and the flute gets its solo line in this work while the harp stands in for all other three instruments. This is a remarkable arrangement. It plays with a dripping sort of staccato effect achieved by using a sort of plastic wire that goes across the strings of the harp, which gives the pizzicato effect of the string trio. You've got to hear this. It's quite a delightful surprise. Yeah, that is a harp sound that you generally don't hear. Track 5, Johann Sebastian Bach, Badinerie from Orchestral Suite No. 2 in B minor, BWV 1067. This is the title track of the album. The flute line heard here is used in a lot of ringtones. It's got a sprightly quality, both instruments playing with a rhythmic lift. I'll forego a sample of this so that listeners don't think they're getting a phone call. I'm just kidding. This is gorgeous, better than your ringtone. In fact, you should probably use this instead of whatever you have. If you're using this Badinerie as your ringtone, use this one with the harp. It'll amaze everyone. And it'll probably calm them down, too. Track 6, Christoph Willibald Gluck, Dance of the Blessed Spirits from Orpheus and Eurydice. Here the harp plays in arpeggiated two-note harmonies as the flute melodizes, sort of like in Schubert's Ave Maria. The dancing quality of the rhythm is well put across. Tracks 7 through 20, we have a big section here, of shorter Bela Bartok works, the Suite Paysanne Hongroise, and this is arranged by Paul Arma. These are all very brief pieces, so we'll sample 1 or 2 of them as we go. Track 7 marked Rubato, and this all marks a change of pace with Bartok's more modal folk song settings. This one has a pretty melody with the harp strumming arpeggios like a guitar. There's a lot of space in this piece. Track 8, Andante poco sostenuto. The harp has some interesting sonorities here, and I'm wondering how they're being achieved. I think with the nails of the fingers. This has a dancing rhythm once the flute melody starts. Let me sample it. got a lilting, hypnotic feel to it, as modal music often does. There's a rather mysterious middle section which sounds more harmonically static in this piece, like some kind of call. Track 9, Poco Rubato. This is beautifully song-like in the flute, with the harp only underlining the harmony on occasion, always with beautiful sonority. Track 10, Andante. This is led into without a pause from the previous song. It's rather similar in tempo, but the theme is different. The harp's accompaniment features guitar-like strummed chords. The flute really gets up there in its range at the end. Track 11, Allegro, features a rather odd rhythm and some interesting sonorities from both instruments, as well as a stop-and-start kind of rhythm, hesitating, then speeding forward. Let's sample this one. When you perform a work like this, it's sort of hard to make it sound all of a piece, but it does here. We're in really good hands. Track 12, Fiel Danse. This is a lively dance with a heavily folk-like theme. The title actually means plural dances. The harp's accompaniment has melodic material in it, and this works exceptionally well here. I'd like to sample this as well. It's really pleasing. That's half of the entire piece. It's only 55 seconds long. Track 13, Allegretto, a slower piece with breathy flute playing and gently strummed chords on the harp. Very attractive. Track 14, Allegretto, a lively dance, folk-like in rhythm if you're familiar with many of Bartók's other dances. It sort of sounds like those, and it's over very quickly. Track 15, L'istesso tempo, the same tempo as the previous dance. This also has a folk dance quality. It's very lightly played and speeds up on the theme's repeat. I thought I'd sample this one instead of 14 because they're sort of similar. Let's hear it. There's more to it after that. There's one more section. Track 16, Assai Moderato, a heavier, dragging tone and melody from the flute as the harp echoes the weight with dragged-out, heavy-sounding arpeggios. Track 17, Allegretto, also dance-like, with sudden retards at the end of phrases. It's very short. Track 18, Poco più vivo. Here the harp and flute both have the melody, as the harp also accompanies. The theme is folk-like and has retards at the end of phrases. Track 19, marked Allegro, a quick dance and rather exciting is played here. It's also very brief and has some teasing repeated chords at the end. And finally track 20, for this work anyway, the album will go on. Allegro, the harp starts this solo with full sound on its rhythmically played chords. The flute comes in with a circling dance pattern. The arrangements of all of these works makes them exceptionally appealing to listen to, and one really wishes they could be longer. I'd like to sample just before we leave this one, the last movement, track 20, where the flute comes in, about 40 seconds in. You know, that rhythm got stuck there for a bit. Track 21, we go to a new composer, Camille Saint-Saëns. Danse Macabre. This is arranged by Giuseppe Garibaldi, not the guy who took over Italy in the 1870s. He spells his name differently, with an O instead of an A. This is a shortened version of the work. Beaudiment writes that they tried to play as if on Halloween, creating dark colors and articulations. It's got a nice repeated quarter note opening on the harp, and I like the way this translates. The harp is subtle in accompaniment. Once the flute is in, we get the macabre rhythm, but we're nowhere near a macabre timbre with these two instruments. It's too pretty, though the musicians, especially Beaudiment, shade the tone and play in a sinister way to create a creepy atmosphere. It's kind of odd hearing this piece with these timbres and this very short length. It sounds fun, though. It's engaging in a way that it probably shouldn't be. Track 22, Claude Debussy, Beau Soir. This is a song arrangement. Needless to say, this works perfectly in this format. Beautiful and sensual tone from both instruments. Debussy's music just translates really well to the harp. Track 23, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, Hindu Lied, or Hindu Song. I really like that because if you look at it in English, it looks like Hindu lied. It's the German word for lead. The harp lends this an effective Asian air. I like the modal melody in this one too. Let's sample it. It's kind of a rare piece that we don't hear often. The piece has a light sadness to it, well captured by Beaudiment. Track 24, Manuel de Falla. These are 3 songs by that Falla set. The first one is called Nana. The harp plays this with a light attack, and the flute molds the melody perfectly to get those Spanish phrase endings to register. You know, that triplet followed by ending note. It's got good characterization, and this has a sultry feel to it. Track 25, Polo by Manuel de Falla. The rhythm in the harp is more aggressive here, guitar-like in its repeated notes. There's real passion by the end of the piece. I'd like to give a brief sample of this. The harp is kept pretty busy in that arrangement. Track 26, Asturiana by Manuel de Falla. This has a plucked guitar-like accompaniment in the harp. The flute's theme has a hypnotic quality to it, as its long tones ride on the arpeggiated patterns of the harp. Finally, the last 4 tracks are the 4 movements of Astor Piazzolla's L'Histoire du Tango. We've heard this piece several times on this podcast. This is arranged by Fabrice Pierre. We've certainly never heard it for this combination of instruments, though. The flute chirps at the beginning of the piece. This is the first movement, Bordel 1900, track 27. There sounds like the tapping of the body of the guitar, but of course we're hearing a harp here, and I'm wondering how those sounds are being achieved. The tempo of the main melody beginning after the 40-second mark is on the fast side. There's a lot of character in the playing, particularly in the flute. I think the tempo here is too fast for a tango, but I'm nevertheless enjoying all the detail in the playing, including the flute's breathy sound. Let's get a sample of this about 1 minute and 45 seconds in. Now, of course, we can hear the tango rhythm in there, but it's not being drawn out. This is being played more for its melody and for its sound. Beaudiment really outdoes himself in timbre and energy in the performance as well. Track 28, Café 1930. The harp starts this out slowly with arpeggiated patterns. The flute comes in again with rich, full tone. The pacing and tone of the instruments make this performance luscious, but this winds up being more song-like than tango-like. At 1 minute and 44 seconds, we hear the tango rhythm, but it's more suggested than up front in this performance. It's the same as in the first movement. At 2 minutes and 59 seconds, we get a completely new section, sounding like a sunlit morning theme on the flute. It's springtime-like and full of life. We hear a repeat of the opening section afterwards with a chirping sound on the flute. I feel like it's springtime in this cafe. Track 29, Nightclub 1960. This is the third movement. It starts with the tango rhythm. Let me sample it. I really think the harp takes away from the sort of sensuality of the tango rhythm. It's just very light. I love the sound of it, though. I like the way this instrumentation exposes Piazzolla's writing. Beaudiment is really making the four movements of this work come alive. I really love his tone and presence in the middle section of this movement. He's poetic. When the opening theme returns, he gets a breath shooting through the flute tone, which I guess is what he calls air spiccato in the notes. Spiccato is when you bounce the bow off the violin strings, and I guess this is his flute version of that. You'll notice it when you hear it. I guess you could say he's bouncing his breath off the interior of the flute. Track 30, Concert d'aujourd'hui, or a concert hall today. The harp tone here is interestingly muted to give a genuine guitar sound. The tango rhythm is audible in the flute's rhythm. Let's hear it. That is indeed a more harmonically advanced concert hall type of tango. The duo prefer fast tempos, and that's the case here too. Again, no complaints. It's enjoyable, but the tango feel evaporates a bit at this speed. It's still noticeable though. The middle section has some lively playing, then the opening section comes back with the flute playing staccato lines and the harp imitating. The harp manages the harsher sounding chords well. You notice them, but the tone of the harp rather sweetens them. So, what a gorgeous album this is. The flute and harp is an unbeatable combination, full of beauty and intimacy and a kind of sensuality of sound, especially when it's in the hands of French players like these, with their heightened sense of timbre. There's something about French flute players and French harp players. They have like a real sensual sense of the timbre that the instrument produces, just like composers when they write orchestral music. Everything on this album comes across with perfect musicality. These two really are special as a duo. All of these arrangements work exceptionally well, and the album is a pleasure to listen to from start to finish. The pleasing timbres of the two instruments rather hide some of the drama and tension in some of the music, but the duo do well enough to draw the tension and climaxes out so that you know they're there. The architecture of the works is well outlined, but it's the moment-by-moment phrasing and timbre that appeals the most. Absolutely, try this out.
I thought this was a gorgeous recording, too. There's a lot of variety of material here, and right away, the harp and the palanque really makes things interesting with all these varied articulations, sometimes sounding guitar-like, and it made me really think of the possibilities of these kind of transcriptions from piano to harp and the different effects that can be achieved. I enjoyed the bar talk a lot more than I thought I would as well. The folkiness and lightness was really cute and fun.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing.
And those folk melodies really come out well here. The sonics on the whole album are just fabulous. What a warm sounding presence. The flute tone is gorgeous and the harp sounds great. And I liked all of the other material as well. As you said, some of the tango is probably not really danceable tempos, doesn't accentuate the rhythm as much as could be done. But overall, there's just so much interesting music on this recording, and it all sounds really wonderful with great sonics.
Okay, the final classical album, our contemporary composer, is someone new to me, Lydia Kakabadse. She's a British composer, but she has multicultural parentage, and that's going to be important in her music. Her mother is Greek-Austrian, and her father is Georgian-Russian. And the album is called Kefi, Choral and Chamber Works. This is performed by the Choir of Royal Holloway, Rupert Gough, director, Cecily Beer on the harp, Mary Bull on the flute, Tom Wagner, or Wagner if he's English, on percussion, the Rossetti Ensemble, they're a piano quartet, Leon Bosch on double bass, Dimitris Gionis on the Greek bouzouki, and we're going to hear a lot of him at the beginning. This is on the Divine Art label, and it was released on July 12th. So Lydia Kakabadze is British-born, and she was brought up in the Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox faith and draws inspiration from Orthodox church music. We'll hear that in the multi-movement 30 Steps that we'll hear. That is the main track on this album. Her style has been inspired by that church music as well as medieval music and Greek and Middle Eastern dance. Okay, so despite the fact that she's British, she doesn't sound like a British composer. She actually sounds more like an East European or maybe Middle Eastern composer, or maybe even a Russian composer in some ways. She's really a mix of a lot of different styles in one person. And yet it's all genuine because this is who she is. She's not just sort of delving into these different musical styles. She lives them. She is them. It's been her life. This record incorporates the ethnic Greek bouzouki into Western classical chamber music in the beginning. And first of all, on the first two tracks, The Feast of Herod. This is for Greek bouzouki, violin, viola, cello, and double bass. The piece depicts a banquet scene where a veiled dancer performs an exotic dance, followed by dancers of the harem. The movements are characterized by an emphasis on melody and rhythm rather than harmony, and that would be the case in especially Middle Eastern music. Track 1, The Veiled Dancer, has the bouzouki opening, and the entire track had me wishing I had some ouzo in the house.
That'd be nice.
Yeah, it's shaped in a Greek folk dance fashion. Let's hear a sample of the beginning and put ourselves into this world. So this starts out sounding traditional, and then the strings come in. You've got this sort of combination of timbres that's pretty interesting that we usually don't hear. It all works very well. The presence of the solo violin breaks up the sound somewhat, though it's using the same scale. The piece is light and enjoyable, and the bass is very palpable on this recording, especially in the opening tracks. Track 2 is the second movement, Dance of the Harem. The Middle Eastern rhythm used here is called maksum. The rhythm has a sort of slower, seductive feel to it. The bouzouki is back after the violin plays the opening theme. This has less of a Greek feel than the opening track. It is, however, equally attractive melodically and rhythmically. Let's hear this moodier, sort of seductive rhythm. So if you're seduced already, as I was, you might want to check out this album. Tracks 3 through 5 give us a bit of a change of pace. Nomadic dances for violin, viola, cello, and double bass, composed in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic. So there's no bouzouki here. These are going to have a very different quality to them. The dances are characterized by an emphasis on melody, ornamentation, and syncopated rhythms, which seek to capture the soul and mystique of the nomadic dance. This is played by the string players of the Rossetti Ensemble. They are Sarah Trickey on violin, Sarah Jane Bradley on viola, and Tim Lowe on cello, with Leon Bosch added to take on the double bass role. Track 3 is the first movement, Ceremonial Gathering. The rhythm here is produced by hard sawing-type bowing on the violins and comes across as severe and a bit harsh, but eminently listenable. It has a Middle Eastern feel to it, especially once the opening rhythm lightens and the strings are allowed to smoothly melodize. There are a lot of pizzicati that give the rhythm a light percussive effect. Track 4, the second movement, is called Herding. This has a slower rhythm and more of a light wail of a melody. The ensemble capture the desert feel of the rhythms and melodies well, though taking away a bit of the harshness due to the fact that they're strings. Let's hear this. Maybe you can hear what I'm saying. Yeah, so in the melodies, I'm hearing a lot of vocal gestures here.
Yeah.
The setting is intriguing. It puts me in mind of the South African-based pieces that Kevin Volans wrote in the 1980s. If you remember, the Kronos Quartet used to record a lot of these. But this, of course, has completely different rhythms and melodies. Track 5 is the third movement, Trekking. There's an uninterrupted, steady, and persistent pace throughout this movement, representing the nomads and making long, arduous journeys venturing beyond ancient trails. The rhythm is insistent. At the opening of the movement, we're given full sound from top to bottom. Harmony is straightforward, as it would be. It's the rhythm and twisting of the modal melody that entice the ear. Kakabadse's writing keeps the music interesting. The melodies all have interesting shapes, and one appealing section cuts into another appealingly. It's really what comes after each sort of section that really keeps these compositions moving. And that's really Kakabadse's strength in putting them across here for me. Not to mention the very authentic feel that she gets in her compositions. Track 6 is called Kefi, and the composer explains the Greek word Kefi is deeply embedded in Greek culture, and there's no direct translation to English for the word. She says for the purposes of this album, you could think of it as meaning joy, vibrancy, and excitement. It's written for Greek bouzouki, violin, viola, cello, and double bass, and was completed in 2021. The piece starts off excitingly with the timbre of the bouzouki in its virtuosic dance melody style. The piece is quicker than anything in the previous work, so we're getting enough variety in rhythm and modes used to sustain interest. I have to say I'm enjoying what I'm hearing. This is a fun, lively piece, and let's sample the opening. Okay, next we have a piano piece, and that changes everything. It's kind of an odd sound to be hearing at this point on the album. Track 7 is the original theme by Anton Diabelli that Beethoven set for his Diabelli variations. So what happened is Anton Diabelli, back in the 1800s, the early 1800s, wrote a 32-bar waltz, which he sent to leading composers of the Austrian Empire, asking each to write a variation on it. Now, they're all men, of course, and 50 variations were published by Diabelli. The German musicologist Claudia Bigos set about asking women composers worldwide to contribute to a project entitled Diabelli Recomposed, and the project culminated in the edition of the complete works Diabelli Recomposed, 50 Diabelli waltz variations by contemporary women composers from around the world. So this is the theme that we hear in this track. It's played on the piano, and I'm thinking this is Rossetti Ensemble pianist John Lenihan, who we're hearing for the only time on this album here. It's played at a quick tempo. Track 8 is the variation that Kakabadse wrote for that collection. It was composed in 2021 and is based on Diabelli's left-hand octave progressions, as well as the tonic and dominant chord progressions, to which Kakabadse has added syncopated rhythms. The first part is chordal and a little solemn. The second part is made up of triplet arpeggios and is faster and lighter, adding to the overall dramatic and exciting effect. So Kakabadse's variation is rhythmically interesting. It's lively and has a quick tempo and some drive to it. She gets into some period figuration for the triplet arpeggios in the second part. The piano makes a good separation between the opening dance-like works and the choral work to come. I don't want to leave John Lenihan out of the album, so we'll do a brief sample of this as well. I want to mention, by the way, the only reason we know the Diabelli Waltz is because Beethoven said it and wrote 33 variations on it. We don't know the 50 variations that he composed. I mean, you can look it up. They're published, but so it's kind of a funny sort of project. The variations by the men are really long forgotten. Only Beethoven's remains. Okay, tracks 9 through 38 is a work called 30 Steps. And this is the major work on the album. It's really the focus. The Hellenic Institute at Royal Holloway commissioned Kakabadse to write a choral work to portray a musical journey or spiritual growth. The lyrics are sung in English, except for steps 1 and 23, which are the original Greek. And the texts all come from The Ladder of Divine Ascent, an ascetic guide, written by the Desert Father St. John Climacus of Sinai in the years 579 to around 649. Well, that's when he lived. In this work of Byzantine spirituality, St. John guides his monks through their spiritual struggles to reach perfection, an inner process of self-discovery comparable to climbing 30 steps on a ladder. Each upward step represents each of the 30 stages of ascetic life, symbolizing our gradual and increasing battle against the human vices, weaknesses, and passions through the acquisition of holy virtues. 30 Steps takes us through this process, stage by stage, towards union with God and the salvation of the soul. This is scored for mixed choirs, soprano, alto, tenor, and 2 bass sections, with harp, flute, and percussion, including timpani. Track 9, Step 1. This is a section called Scene 1, Renunciation of the World. This track has James Gooding as tenor, and the chant is Greek. The male voices renounce their earthly material pleasures. When the soprano and altos enter, they interact in an antiphonal manner. The percussion is vividly captured in all its dimensionality on the recording. The male voices are back a bit, but register well, and there's a chime that occasionally sounds. The entire feel is appealing, though this work has a completely different musical profile than the previous 8 tracks we heard on this album. It's more orthodox sounding, more spiritual, more sacred, let's say. The moment at 1 minute 35 seconds or so when the altos and sopranos enter is pretty magical. And I guess I could sample it, but I'll take the magic away, so I'm going to leave it to yourself. You really need to hear the first minute and 35 seconds so that entry can register. Track 10, Step 2, Phoebe Wakefield on alto. This starts monophonically. The harp enters here. The alto warns, "Let him who runs the race imitate not Lot's wife, but Lot himself, and flee." This starts a cappella. Voices sing with droning voices holding down the harmony. The harp comes as a bit of a surprise when it enters, and it's a new unexpected timbre in this desert landscape of drones. Track 11, Step 3, Foreboding and Tension are introduced. This step centers around how dreams can really be tricks from devils. The harp is present here along with light percussion and flutter-tonguing flute. So this is a good place to sample since all of the elements are coming into focus here. We get most of the elements heard in the opening steps in this one sample. Let's give it a listen. Now, you're not hearing this in stereo, but there's some interesting spacing between the voices, and you can sort of hear them ponging around in your head if you're wearing headphones. So try to hear this in stereo. Track 12, Step 4, is calmer, with the choir singing a cappella on the theme of practicing unquestioning obedience to a superior. Scene 1 ends here, and I like the clarity of the different layers of choral singing here. Background men droning, altos and sopranos almost chanting their line more forward. The singing is mostly on the somber side, but when it bursts out with more passion, the orthodox influence is clearly audible. This simply ends with the alto voices tailing off. Track 13 is Step 5, and it marks the beginning of Scene 2. This is sung grave solenne by the altos. It's reflective in nature, relating to escaping punishment by voluntarily accepting retribution. This starts out even more quietly than the previous track ended. The singing is touching, and there are gentle droning voices shimmering in the background. Lovely performance by the choir here. Track 14, Step 6, quasi-syncopated lullaby style. This depicts the impossibility of repentance without remembrance of death. As with a lullaby, this has an appealing melody, though it's sung in the Orthodox Church style, with full bloom on the soprano voices. The tenors then take a verse. I'll give a sample of this. This is about a minute into the track. Track 15 is Step 7 and features Joseph Morris as tenor. The sopranos alternate with the rest of the choir in antiphonal style on the importance of mourning the death of someone, that means. This ends Scene 2. The sopranos come in church style a cappella with an appealingly sung melody answered by the rest of the choir. Track 16, Step 8, is the beginning of Scene 3, subtitled Overcoming Vices. The male voices remain silent during Step 8. The flute interacts with the altos and then the sopranos. This has a floating cello line over the harp. The singers float like the harp in their vocal line. The rhythm has a sort of walking, moving forward feeling to it. Let's give it a sample. Track 17 is Step 9. Timpani and jazz-style harp continue the same musical scale. Here, the baritone and bass voices introduce the main theme to the words, "Remembrance of wrongs is the consummation of anger." Variations follow. There's some nice trading of vocal timbres in this movement. The harp and timpani add a light martial feel to this via rhythm. Track 18 is Step 10. We're in A minor here, as well as in Steps 11 and 12. All three steps make use of responsorial singing. This starts monophonically in the altos, and the men's voices underline the end of the phrases. Track 19, step 11, is similar to the previous step musically, with the choir singing a cappella. Here the men's voices generally start the phrase and the choir finishes them. Track 20, step 12, starts with the basses, and the tenors answer in Eastern Orthodox style with those wailing voices so familiar from that kind of music. The choir does well to put this sound across. Track 21, step 13, sopranos and altos. The theme is despondency, and the bare intervals blossom into rich harmony. The sopranos start this quietly. This is more calming at the opening than it is despondent. The blossoming is subtle, and the harmonies are all sung quietly. Track 22, step 14, pesante, uses parallel octaves, augmented seconds, open triads, and a heavy drum beat. Baritones and basses open. Singing gluttony is a delusion of the eyes. Basses sing in monophony, and the rest of the choir enters with octaves and then harmony. This has a striding forward type of rhythm. Track 23, step 15, has Joseph Morris as the tenor soloist, and it centers around the subject of purity. It begins with the solo tenor introducing the main theme, later developed by the sopranos with harp accompaniment, then developing further into a call and response form. The music remains gentle, with the sopranos entering with the harp. The question and answer section is all gently sung. Let's sample this. Track 24, step 16, is characterized by two distinct phrases, the first sung by male voices and the second by female voices responding. It's a cappella, and also gentle in approach, with wonderful drones in the bass. Track 25, step 17, is similar in style to step 16, with two distinct sections of the choir interacting with each other. This ends scene 3, it's a cappella, and it has a nice glow to it in the answering phrases because of their upward movement and sudden addition of timbral color in the voices. This caught my ear, and I'd like to sample this. Track 26, step 18, begins scene 4. The subject is self-denial. The mood in this step is anguished and melancholy. There's a hush over this section. It's softly chanted, often on a single or conjunct notes. Track 27, step 19, features Esme Ellis as the soprano. The harp plays in lullaby style. We haven't heard the harp in a while, so it adds some timbral color here. And this is very pretty. The text praises sleep, and that's something I praise too. I enjoy sleeping. Let's hear a bit of this. There's something almost Christmassy about that, I would say. Track 28, step 20. There's no pause between this and the previous track. It has a harp, bass drum, and suspended cymbal accompanying the flute's haunting melody. This creates a sense of foreboding. The altos and male voices sing a slowly descending chromatic sequence, adding to a sense of unease. The vocals continue in much the same way, but there's a Middle Eastern caravan type of rhythm to the instrumental part. It's rather a surprise after so much Eastern Orthodox harmonic style. The flute plays in modal harmony. I'd like to sample this track as well. Sort of a little revisiting of the beginning of the album at this point. Track 29, Step 21, more upbeat according to the notes, but I disagree. The baritones and basses introduce the main theme, which is cowardice. The harmony starts rather quietly, but builds to something momentarily brighter, and we end with drones in the bass. Step 22 features Reuben Dales as the alto singer and Alicia Hunt as the soprano. This is written in the style of a ballad. The solo alto sings, "Who among men knows the thoughts of a man, except the spirit of a man within him?" The harp is back, and the alto sounds more like a male countertenor here. Both the alto and soprano sing in appealing harmony. I'd like to sample this as well. Track 31 is Step 23, and this begins similarly to Step 1 with a beat of a bass drum and a chime punctuating certain statement endings. This is also sung in Greek, and at the end the choir switches to English, proclaiming, "A proud monk has no need of a devil." Track 32, Step 24. Joseph Morris is the tenor. The style is similar to Step 22, which we just heard a sample of. The choir alternates with flute and harp. The tenor voice is sweet and appealing on its own. The choir comes in after the tenor's opening lines. The flute and harp take over, playing a folk song-like theme. Track 33, Step 25, centers around slow-moving chordal progressions. These are sung by the full choir. Track 34, Step 26, James Gooding is the tenor and Sophie Janes the alto. This concludes Scene 4 with cadence patterns widely used in the Russian Orthodox liturgy. It starts in the minor key and ends in the major key. The chime returns here, and the tenor, in a low part of his range, begins a chant that is answered by the choir. Track 35, Step 27, starts Scene 5, subtitled Acquiring Peace of the Soul. Accompanied by the harp and sung in canon style, Step 27 centers around the subject of solitude and the power of a solitary monk, which lies in abundance of prayer. The harp begins this with a pretty introduction, which the choir then begins harmonizing over. Let's sample this. Track 36 is Step 28. It begins and ends with the tenors singing about the virtues of prayer. In between, tenors and sopranos alternate, followed by altos and tenors singing in tandem. It's quiet and meditative in approach, with droning basses eventually coming in to accompany. Track 37, Step 29, features Lucy Mitten as the soprano. This alternates between choir and solo soprano and ends Scene 5. Lucy Mitten has a sweet soprano as enjoyable to listen to here. It's a shame this is the only time we hear her solo on the album. In fact, all of the solo voices have a similar quality. I particularly enjoyed this soprano. And finally, track 38, we reach step 30, which is scene 6 all by itself, the supreme trinity of the virtues. The final step brings together a range of different styles and thematic material from earlier scenes and includes dramatic input from the flute, harp, and percussion. It ends in triumphant style, as a work dedicated to this subject should. This has a question and answer opening, then moves to full choir, and then to full instrumentation of harp and percussion. It ends on an amen sent off by a percussion rumble. And if you thought getting through those 30 tracks was long, I expect that the actual spiritual practice is reflected in that, because it takes a long time to remember all of this. Anyway, overall, this is an interesting and highly varied set of compositions by Lydia Kakabadse. In fact, the common denominator is the composer herself. The program can be thought of as being in 3 sections. First, the Greek and Middle Eastern modal dance music section that we get from tracks 1 to 6, the traditional classical piano section that acts as a separation between the first and last parts of the album, that's tracks 7 and 8, and the rest of the program, which is a setting in Orthodox Church style of a holy text. It includes some traditional modal harmony in its instrumentals, but the rest is modal church harmony. The album could be said to summarize Kakabadse's style, or we can say styles, but she emerges as a singular composer, one that's easy to approach, and one that generally lifts the spirits. The big work here is, of course, the 30 steps, and while it's composed of 30 short sections, it's varied enough to keep the listener interested. I listen to it with the text in hand. Spiritual texts interest me, and when they're set musically, I find them easier to digest, so I really appreciated listening to this. It's all very positive music, much needed in our contemporary world.
I enjoyed the opening instrumental works a lot. It was really fun to hear the bouzouki in this setting.
Yeah.
And the choral work, the 30 steps, was calming, and the arrangement's very interesting. The sparse instrumentation added a lot to the focus of the works. As you mentioned, I would suggest setting aside time when you can follow the texts while you listen. They're really quite interesting, and to see how they relate to the arrangements. To me, the Diabelli is kind of an odd inclusion in here. I mean, it's sort of her profile as a composer, as you mentioned. And maybe it separates the 2 parts of the program, kind of dividing things up. It was a little bit odd to hear a kind of standard classical piece in there, but no big distraction. I enjoyed that as well. Kind of cleanses the palate before you go into the choral work. Interesting composer, and there's a lot of depth to the 30 steps, and I think you'll find a lot of things to enjoy in a lot of small detailed passages in there. All right, on the jazz side, you told me we were going to do modal, so I've gone to the ends of the earth to find some recordings.
In a way, so did I.
To gather some musical modal kind of influences I thought that I could find from my recording list. We're going to start out with a pianist from Armenia. Now, I've read that traditional Armenian folk music is built on systems of tetrachords rather than Western scales, but I don't know much about it. So let's check out this recording from pianist Tigran Tatevosyan. It's called Mertan Itev on the O-Tone label. Go back a little ways. This came out June 28th. Tigran Tatevosyan was born in a small town in Armenia. He began 8 years of classical piano training at age 6. Became interested in improvised music at an early age, and after completing his bachelor's degree, he decided to pursue jazz. 2017, he enrolled in the Rachmaninoff Conservatory in Rostov, Russia, with the aim of completing a master's degree in jazz piano. Additionally, he explored the works of Oscar Peterson, Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, Lyle Mays, and Keith Jarrett, and he also analyzed classical music composers such as Debussy and Rachmaninoff. He moved to Hamburg in 2020, furthering his studies, and this is his debut recording, influenced both by Armenian musical tradition and modern jazz. So on this recording, Tigran Tatevosyan on piano, and most of the compositions are his originals. Ziv Ravitz on drums, Georgi Kiknadze on bass. This was recorded at Fattoria Musica, Osnabrück, Germany, in April of 2022. recording engineer Stefan Van Weilik, mixing and mastering engineer Katsuhiko Naito in New York. The recording is going to get going with an original composition celebration, and things start out busily and rhythmically interesting with a perpetual piano line in the right hand of notes in a 6-3-6 pattern with a left-hand line below. Bass joins the left-hand figures and drum fills add in. Tatevosyan moves the busy pattern to the left hand to put a melody over the top. It starts out with a folkiness but then turns kind of sunny. Let's hear this recording get started. Things get lighter and sparse for Tatevosyan's improvisations. His melodic ideas connect nicely, and you can sense his classical training in the shape of his lines. Ravitz really pressurizes things on the drums, so let's come back in and hear some of his improvisations. When the rhythmic push dissipates into a drum solo for Ravitz from there, it works to a pause, and then the opening piano figures start up again to bring in a final round of the melody and an ending with a sense of an unwinding clock. We can tell that Tatevosyan has a well-formed technique and a lot of dexterity already. Track 2, Thelonious Monk's Brilliant Corners, title track from his 1957 recording, arranged here by Tatevosyan. Jazz fans will know this one from Monk's original version with Sonny Rollins. Ravitz gets it started on drums, and Tatevosyan transforms the already quirky Monk melody with a new rhythmic feel, a softer transition section, and some rippling figures before Ravitz's drums are back in force. Let's hear it get going. Tatevosyan plays around with the melody figures and starts his improvisation softly, while Kiknadze reminds us of the rising bass figure. He makes it rhythmic and has some interesting scale ideas, too. Let's hear some of the improvisations on this tune as well. Back to the melody there, played in a somewhat comically heavy way to finish it up, with some dreamy rising lines at the end. Track 3 is the title track, Mertan Itev, which is a traditional Armenian folk song arranged by Tatevosyan here, a solo piano version with ringing notes and modern harmonization. Tatevosyan uses some rapidly repeating notes, creating a kind of tremolo effect. This is a short track that we can hear pretty much all of. I'll just fade it out a little bit on the long, sustained delay. And that's it. Track 4, Forgotten City. This is unique and pretty. The intro has little piano interval figures that seem to be trying to get momentum going into the melody that has a 6-beat feel. As the lines move on, bass and piano join together in spots. Let's take a listen. Tatevosyan's improvisations on this work from smooth connected lines to percussive chords. and back to the melody from there to a gentle ending. Track 5 is The Sorcery Manifestation. There are 3 of these short sorcery pieces on the recording, all solo piano pieces. And since we're in the modal mood tonight, let's check out some of the interesting minor scales in this first one. Mysterious. Oh, it's almost over there. The whole track is about 1 minute and 20 seconds long. Track 6, Memories of a Dream. The drum started out and Kakabadse's bass takes the lead on the melody that sounds like a folk processional over this drum beat. Tatevosyan takes over for the next round of the melody. Kakabadse has the first improvised solo on bass on this tune, so while we're here, let's check out some of his playing. Tatevosyan's piano solo is melodic and has a folk sentiment to his scales and ornaments. The ending is unique, with dainty piano over a drum beat that really kicks. Track 7, The Wind's Dance. This has a rubato solo piano opening with ringing repeated notes. After a pause, Tatevosyan establishes a rhythmic 6-beat feel with a repeated note to bring the others in. I want to sample here from where the piano melody starts, since it has quirky phrasing and interesting harmonic changes. Tatevosyan's improvisations are playful, with a lot of synced-up two-handed figures like you hear there. Ravitz pushes him on with some intense but light drumming, connecting back to another time through the melody that we heard previously, with a surprising chord at the end of the tune. Track 8, The Sorcery Ritual. This is the second solo sorcery piece. It's longing with some interesting modal scale harmonies. It clocks in at just over a minute and a half. Track 9, A Child's Mind. This is charming with a kind of impressionistic solo opening piano section. His Debussy's study might be an influence here. When the drum beat kicks in, it takes on a cyclic kind of phrasing like a child's music box. From midway through, Tatevosyan flushes out the harmonies with bigger chords, and overall it's a short piece at just 2 minutes and 20 seconds. Track 10 is Blessing. This has a very tricky rhythmic beginning. On the descending line of the intro, it sounds like quintuplets over the 4-beat feel with ringing bass notes on the downbeats. Things are lightening up there over the interesting drumming of Ravitz, and Tatevosyan builds up rhythmic excitement in his improvisations, but it chills out in the middle of the tune. Let's hear some of that transition. We'll build up some excitement again, but drums and bass are faded out, leaving sparse high piano lines only for an unexpected ending. And the recording ends up with track 11, The Sorcery Reflection. This is the longest of the sorcery pieces. It's introspective and played sensitively, almost achingly. Tatevosyan lets some sustained harmonic tension linger after 3 minutes before the final resolution. And that's the recording. It's an impressive debut for Tatevosyan. He's got loads of technique and ideas, bringing influences from Armenian music and mixing them with modern jazz harmonic ideas. The playing is impressive all around. Monk's brilliant corners stands out in contrast to Tatevosyan's original compositions. Stylistically, I would have liked to have heard a jazz standard, at least one, and maybe more original compositions by pianists that influenced his style in the program, since this is his debut, so we could get a little more of his sense of stylistic development that made his concept of playing. But anyway, he's shown us a multifaceted view of his own culturally informed concept. Otherwise, Kiknadze's bass playing is solid with some standout solo spots, and Ravitz's drumming is unique with a lot of interesting tones and textures around the kit. Check this recording out for something unique in a piano trio setting.
Yeah, I have to say this really appealed to my sort of classical ear. It's really jazz with architecture, and you really don't hear like classical type architecture where you have these sections like built in jazz so much. Actually, I'm not sure some of the tracks are jazz at all. I mean, some of the figures Tatevosyan uses recall classical music very heavily to me, such as the quick arpeggios, and some recall more of the older New Age Windham Hill type light classical figures. You remember them, like George Winston and Liz Story back in the 80s? Tatevosyan puts a lot of the ingredients into this stew, including modal harmony and things from his Armenian background. And that gives it all some content and weight. There's certainly something there, and the pleasing yet inventive harmony draws the listener along. The structure of the pieces and the musical ideas in them are inventive, and I like the way Tatevosyan would often build in his solos from what he played before, an approach that makes his playing and his direction really clear. Ziv Ravitz on drums and Georgi Kiknadze on bass equally have inventive approaches to their parts, and I especially liked the bass player Kiknadze's way with the themes on Memories of a Dream, which I found eloquent both in phrasing and tone. But really, this is Tatevosyan's album. While I personally prefer something more straightforwardly classical or jazz, this was certainly a worthwhile and enjoyable listen.
All right, get those passports out again.
Oh boy, got a lot of stamps in mind now.
Now we're going to go down to South Africa. And we have heard some South African jazz on the podcast a couple times in the past. This is something different again.
Yeah.
From saxophonist Linda Sikhakhani. And that's a male name, not like the girl you grew up with in New York, Linda. Mike.
Yeah, Linda.
This is on Blue Note Records' iLadi. Came out July 12th. Sikhakhani comes from Umlazi Township near Durban, South Africa, and this recording shows spiritual experiments and modal investigations influenced by John Coltrane's later period of music. Sikhakhani's previous recordings are Ensemble on Rope-a-Dope Records from 2022, and there's a self-released recording on streaming you can find from 2017, Two Sides, One Mirror. He's also made several recordings with the pianist here, Dududzo Makatini. So on this recording, Linda Sikhakhani tenor sax and original compositions, Dududzo Makatini piano, and also producer of the recording, Zwelaki Duma Bel Leper on bass, and Kweku Sambri on drums. There's going to be some titles that are difficult. They're not so hard to pronounce. They're hard to read the way these are spelled out, but I'll do my best. Track 1 is Igosa, which I believe stands for guardian or leader. A ringing modal chord opening from Makatini gets some thundering drums and a pulsing repeated note bass denoting a 4-beat feel before Sikhakhani comes in with a melody phrase. Let's take a listen to this recording get going. That melody idea goes around again, and there's a section with some harmonic changes before Sikhakhani is off improvising. Sombri is decorating with different clicky ideas and symbols, and he builds it up to an intense climax. Let's check out some of Sikhakhani's soloing. Makatini follows from there with the solo mixing crashing chords and darting lines. They take it through the melody sections again with some final softening improvisations from Sikhakhani to a peaceful ending, and the John Coltrane and McCoy Tyner influence comes through right away, but with a more elemental African character to the music. Track 2, Inkeli, which the Blue Note notes say is an ode to matriarchy. This starts out with a 3-beat bass ostinato from Rupert that is quite hypnotic. Makatini decorates with soft piano notes as cymbals come in, and Sikhakhani floats a soft high sax melody. The first 2 parts have 16 measure sections. Let's take a listen. Well, the ostinato breaks up with some drum fills briefly at around 1.5 minutes. Makatini's dreamy piano improvisations move freely in contrast to the constant throb of the bass. Sikhakhani follows with sax improvisations that sing out with a shining tone, legato with long note phrases. He connects back to a more embellished version of the original melody, and the ostinato dissolves into a simpler rhythmic piano and drum groove as it quietens to the end. Track 3, Ukukushulwa, a heavy and ominous modal 6-beat tune like Coltrane and Tyner 60s jazz. Makatini rings out the chords on an 8-measure intro. There's an 8-measure sax melody, then a 4-measure interlude before another section. Let's take a listen. Sikhakhani continues on improvising after the second section. His phrasing is relaxed and searching, and Makatini is more intense in contrast with percussive chords and speedy phrases. He brings it back to the sax melody with some sweeps of runs that he also brings back over the softening lower register sax ending. Let's hear the end of the tune. Track 4, La Landella, a sax and piano duo with a curious start from Makatini. It soon forms into an intimate ballad with tight coordination between Sikhakhani and Makatini. Seems to be a 20-measure melody, and then Makatini has some solo improvisations. His phrasing and whole approach is quite unique. Sikhakhani returns for a final section with a glowing tone and wide vibrato, and a final choppy piano ending. Track 5, Indatshana. This has more of a post-bop modern flavor to it. The melody is tricky with a lot of sudden changes. It's a 14-measure repeating idea. Check out the syncopated bass work from Lepere that continues on under Sikhakhani's improvisations. Makatini also has an animated piano solo, and Sumbri gets to do some interesting drum work as they go around the harmonic pattern. Let's check some of that out as well. Once more around the melody from there to wrap it up. Track 6 is Mama, a very slow and sensitive ballad with Sikhakhani showing great tone and control in the upper register. Makatini has a delicate solo with ringing notes on this one, and when Sikhakhani returns, he sticks to the melody, and then it goes into a dreamy final section with soft interaction from bass and piano. Track 7, Influential Moments. This has a unique 6-beat groove with a rhythm section intro alternating between two modal chord ideas. The legato sax melody has some interesting harmonic twists under it. It's too long to get into a 1-minute sample, so let's take a listen to some of Sikhakhani's improvisations that come after a reset to the intro idea to get him started. Makatini gets an intense solo too, before Sikhakhani's back for a final melody section and a vamping outro like the opening that gets quieter to the end. And the recording ends up with track 8, Ekako. This is rubato throughout. It swells and sounds quite joyful. Continues to grow even more, but then comes down softer, and Zwalake Duma Bel Le Père gets his solo bass spotlight on the recording, so let's check out some of his playing. Sikhakhani will return and work up the melody again in flowing waves to the end. And that finishes the recording. The influence of John Coltrane and McCoy Tyner looms large over the music of Linda Sikhakhani, but he brings a renewed freshness to it with injection of African inflection and interpretation. Sikhakhani doesn't try to impress with speedy lines of improvisations, but rather conveys his ideas with force of intention and a rich tonal palette on the saxophone. He shows great control when playing softly and in the high register. Makatini's unique piano style and improvisations stand out throughout, and Zwelake Duma Bel Le Père's bass playing is a rhythmic engine here that frees up Kwekis Sumbri to do a lot of decorative drumming that catches your ear throughout. The spiritual intent of the music shines through the whole recording.
Yeah, it's funny you said spiritual intention, because I felt like Sikhakhani plays his themes as though they're all like ritual chants. They kind of sound like they have this real sort of purpose to them. They're slow, they're steady, they're very deliberate, and he's always using that full tone. He's not shading it at all. As a result, the music has a hypnotic quality to it. There's a boldness and hardness to the approach. Everyone playing like they're etching their tones in stone, like it's going to be remembered forever. Yeah. He lightens his tone a bit for the more sensitive fourth track, Ula Landieta, but by the time his solo comes, he's back to that full hard tone. I feel like the second half of the album lightens up a little bit, but he's a very present performer, and he's very serious too. I think I would have liked this if it had a little bit of lightness and humor to it, but I don't think he's really that kind of player. This comes across more of a statement of purpose to me, which is fine. The last four tracks have more of a traditional jazz approach to them as opposed to the more like ritualistic compositions at the beginning. Most tracks are on the slow side, and the band leaves a lot of space. It is certainly a different album. It's well recorded by Blue Note, as they always tend to be. So this is something unique, really.
Yeah, kind of a revisit of Coltrane's spiritual jazz.
Maybe. Yeah, there's no lightness and humor in that either. But so I guess I shouldn't have said that, but there you go. That's just what I got out of it, so it was interesting.
get the passports ready once more for one final destination. That's going to be Italy.
Yeah, and my final destination, because I'm staying there.
Hey, and this is on Da Vinci Records, and we've done a lot of their classical releases. This is on their jazz division. So first one, I'll be checking out some more of their jazz output. This is by a group called the Strait Project. That's Strait. It's called Water Dance. Came out July 19th. The musicians here are Carlo Nicita on flute, Marcello Conti on piano, Tommaso Pugliese on double bass, and Federico Sacca on drums. From the Da Vinci site, describes the recording, saying, Carlo, Marcello, Tommaso, and Federico light up the environment with the light and colors of the Strait of Messina. This album is the first great work dedicated to the music of the Strait Project, an extraordinary, accomplished collective that assimilates, elaborates on, and fuses diverse influences and teachings. Their creative path unravels in a metaphoric labyrinth where the streets cross and mingle to the point of finding a unique, evocative style. That's a pretty poetic description of Da Vinci there.
Yeah. Whoever's writing for that company, keep them on. That sounds pretty good.
Anyway, this is inspired by the music and compositions of Wayne Shorter, and we're going to hear a little bit of his work, as well as 8 original compositions. The Strait of Messina, that's between Sicily and Calabria. Let's check out this recording. The first piece is Caridi, and this is a composition by Marcello Conti. This has an interesting start with muted rhythmic piano from Conti getting joined by drum toms. That goes on for about a minute, and the piano becomes unmuted to play once around the waltzing AABA melody. Nicita joins in for another melody round on flute, and then continues on, spitting out staccato pitches over ringing bass from Pugliese. Let's listen from where the flute comes in a little bit into the tune. Nicita continues on with more full-toned lines in a dialogue with the bass, but gets back to the staccato playing with some vocalizations too. Conti gets some improvised piano over thundering drums from Sacca back into the melody, getting joined by Nicita for a few more rounds with intense flute tone. Track 2 is Bloom. This is by Carlo Nicita. Another waltzing tempo. There's an 8-measure rhythm section intro phrase with interesting accents. It goes around again, joined by some mysterious flute from Nicita. The main melody is 28 measures with a lifting feel worked together by flute and bass. Then the intro section comes back again into another melody round. Let's check out the beginning. the second time around the melody, Nichita continues on with an improvised solo that gets more and more animated and reaches up high and gets breathy. Let's check it out. Conti continues from there with a piano solo that builds and releases tension nicely. Nichita's back for another time around the melody and some final primal improvisations over the intro idea. And Saka continues on with solo drumming to the ending that connects to the next track, which is Wayne Shorter's Footprints from his 1966 recording Adam's Apple. The original starts with a bass ostinato introduction. Here, Conti makes an extended opening of rubato piano chords decorated with cymbals. After about a minute and a half, he gets it into tempo with the waltzing rhythm, and Nichita joins in on the melody. Let's check it out from there. Continues on with some fluttery and staccato improvisations over a bass ostinato, like in the original Shorter tune, to the ending. Track 4, Trying to Do the Job. This is by Marcello Conti. Now you're up for something interesting on the intro to this tune. Looking at Nichita's YouTube channel, he calls this technique slap flute. It has a unique percussive effect mixed with some breathy vocalizations. The bass joins with a melody phrase underneath, piano and drums enter, and then Nichita is back with the melody line, which is more breath than note, doubled by the bass below. It's alternating between 4 and 3 beat measures. Let's check this out. Pugliese gets the first solo on bass here that really cries out, so let's hear a little bit of his playing. Conti follows on piano, ringing out heavy chords in his solo, and Nichita's back with a full-toned version of the melody and some improvisations that get some interesting harmonics and vocal effects. Track 5 is called Dorico. It's another 7-beat tune here, started out with a bass ostinato. Nichita's in for a 16-measure flute melody section and then continues on with some staccato playing over the ostinato. Conti gets an improvised piano section with calmer bass lines underneath, then the ostinato is back to get Nichita started on flute improvisations, but it breaks up into a more freer flow with exciting drum fills from Saka. The ostinato and staccato flute is back to bring in the melody again from there, and the bass and flute ostinato makes an outro for some more drum fills from Saka to end it. Track 6 is Rebecca's theme. This is composed by Tommaso Pugliese. A rubato solo piano intro from Conti starts it out and gets it into a waltzing tempo for the melody, getting joined by Nichita. On this one, let's sample Conti's piano solo that has some delicate triplet figures sprinkled in. Nichita follows from there with a flute solo. Pugliese gets an enthusiastic bass solo too, and then Nichita's left on his own for some flute lines, getting rejoined by piano, bass, and drums in succession, with improvised lines back into the melody. The ending has a little rhythmic and harmonic surprise to enjoy. Track 7, Abuela Cigara, grandmother cicada?
I guess.
Is what it means. Kind of strange.
Maybe it's a folk story or something.
Could be. Well, this is composed by Carlo Nicita. This starts with a 4-beat bass, ostinato, and staccato slap flute for an 8-measure intro. The minor melody is an attractive Latiny melody. Flute and bass alone take the repeating A section, and then piano takes over with drums joining in on the B section. The flute comes back for another A section of the melody and also a final section that has repeated phrases. Conti's up for a piano solo, and Nicita's flute solo here has great melodic ideas and phrasing and ends with edgy sounds. Pugliese gets a fine bass solo too, and Nicita's back from the B section of the melody and continues on with some repeats of the final section to a hesitated ending. Track 8 is called Ron Miller. This is composed by the drummer Federico Sacca. And I know Ron Miller is a jazz pianist and composer who specializes in modal harmonies. He's taught a lot of famous jazz players, so there must be some connection there. This is interesting, with shifting modal harmonies, changing meters, and bass movement. There's a melody with vocalizations and breathy flute together. It works through some more sections, and then Nicita gets a flute solo, so let's hear some of his playing on this tune. Conti follows with a piano solo next. We hear the melody sections again, and rhythmic piano chords take it to a soft, slowed ending. Track 9 is Wayne Shorter's Infant Eyes, and this is from 1966 Speak No Evil recording. Nicita has some multi-tracking and effects going on for an interesting intro. Bass and drums add to the wash of sound. It comes into tempo with the piano intro to the melody. I'll sample right before Nichita comes in with the melody so that you can also hear some of Pugliese ringing bass that takes over. And the whole tune ends very soon with some final flute thoughts from Nichita. And the recording ends up with track 10, Balla con me, by Carlos Nichita. This has a fun flute intro into a dreamy melody that has a lot of rhythmic change-ups and nice strumming from Saka switching up between toms and cymbals. Let's hear the beginning of it. Conte gets a piano solo with runs and percussive chords, and Nichito's flute solo is like a butterfly in flight. Pugliese has a busy bass solo too, with some staccato flute backing, and Saka gets some drum filling before a final flute melody section to end it and end the recording. So inspired by Wayne Shorter's compositions, the Strait project pulls you into their own dreamy world of interesting compositions. Things start off with a lot of waltz feels and then progress to other interesting meters. There are a lot of lush harmonies and appealing melodies in their original compositions. Nichita fascinates with his flute facility and interesting staccato and slap techniques through the melodies and improvised solos. Pugliese and Conti have a lot of attractive solo spots too, and Saka's drumming is constantly changing to match the mood, whether light and textured or heavy and punctuated. It's an enjoyable escape into their water dance world.
Yeah, interesting. To me, this album sort of glides by, for the most part. And it just kind of made me feel like summery sounds of the sea, like it was summertime. It was really the perfect time of year to be listening to this. Carlo Nichita on the flute rather stands out on the album for all of his percussive effects that he gets. Some of them even reminded me of Japanese music, the shakuhachi where they blow, this kind of hollow.
Right.
Column of wind into the instrument. He does a bit of that too, and he experiments with his tone during solos really often. I just found him really interesting to listen to all the way through. Marcello Conti on the piano rather balances out Nichita's adventurous tone with warm piano playing throughout. I really liked that. It was a pleasure to hear his overall sound, warmth, and Tommaso Pugliese's bass is full-toned and well-recorded here. When he gets solos, he's front and center in the mix, and that made his playing more enjoyable for me. And he has good solo ideas too. And we don't get a full solo from Federico Sacca, but he gets some splashy sounds under the occasional vamp, and he sets a positive atmosphere throughout. It's a really interesting album. I thought it made a good summer listen for its fresh overall sound, but I'm sure I'm going to listen to this into the autumn and really all year long. I thought it was a good feeling album.
It does kind of have a watery kind of theme to it overall. Like you'd want to be near the ocean when you were listening to it.
Yeah, that's sort of what I got out of it too.
Well, that wraps up our loads of modes here for this episode. It was interesting. A little bit off the beaten path and some interesting harmonies that we got to hear.
We've unloaded our modes.
Yes.
And now we can walk freely again.
As always, we want to say thanks to Fast Signs of Staten Island for our glowing neon logo. And what do we have on the menu for next week's episode, Mike?
I've got all like minor label stuff, which I think is great, but it's sort of hard to put together because it's hard to get the information from them. First of all, I got two from the Navona Records label. The first one is called Basso Profondo, and it's two works for double bass, and one of them is an old one, the Bach cello suite, which I think is played on not on a double bass, but on an old kind of period instrument, like a viol or something. I'm not really sure, but I'll have to check that out. And the other one is a Mstislav Weinberg work from the 20th century that was specifically written for the solo double bass. So who knows what that'll sound like? We'll find out.
Yeah.
Could be an adventure. The other album I have by them is called Resurgence New Works for Cello and Piano. That's on the Navona label too. I've also chosen a record called Turkish Flavors 100 Years of Turkish Music on the Prospero Classical label. I don't know much about Turkish music at all, so it's going to be a week of discovery. So we'll be doing like Turkish music too.
Over on the jazz side, I've got a debut recording from a young Dutch trumpeter, Bram van der Glind. It's called Mirrors. Check that out. And then we'll listen to a new release from Danish guitarist Soren Lee. It's called Hope. And then I've got an interesting cordless quintet recording from Tim Armacost. And that's going to feature Tom Harrell, Gary Smiljan on baritone sax, John Patitucci on bass, Tim Armacost on tenor sax. Should be interesting to have a full lineup of horns, but with no chordal instrument. So that's called Something About Believing, and we'll check that out as well. If you want to get a jump on listening to those recordings a few hours after this episode is published, I'll have the playlist up on Deezer so you can start listening to those recordings with us early if you'd like, and there'll also be a link to it over on our Facebook page. Any final words before we sign off, Mike?
I would just like to see no one ever come in last place in the Olympics again.
Unless they're a pro.
Unless they're a pro. Well, if they're a pro. Unless they're a pro like me, I would take that last place for them, yeah.
The pro last place.
I would be the pro last place position. Or anyone who wants to work for me. There you go.
Interesting career idea. Anyway, that'll wrap it up for episode 177. We'll be back with 178 and those recordings mentioned next week. So until then, keep listening, and we'll see you again next time.